Hello, and welcome to today's webinar titled The Role of the Paraprofessional in the Inclusive Class with Dr. Julie Causton. We are thrilled that you can join us today. This webinar is the last webinar in our Inclusive Education webinar series, which features presentations from 3 outstanding experts in the field of inclusive education. My name is Nicole Eredix, and I'm creator of the online resource, The Inclusive Class, and I will be your moderator in this series. Today's webinar is presented by Brooks Publishing Company and The Inclusive Class, which is an online resource for parents and teachers. Now, before we get started, I have just a few housekeeping items to discuss. First, we are recording today's webinar, and a copy of it will be posted after the webinar at www.brookspublishing.com/inclusive-ed-webinars. A copy of this URL will be included in your post-webinar email. Second, everyone who is attending today's webinar is automatically entered into a drawing. 3 lucky winners will choose any combination of 3 of Julie Causton's books, absolutely free. The winners will be selected and notified by email. And finally, Brooks Publishing is extending a special 20% discount on all of Julie Causton's books. In addition to posting exclusive free content, including excerpts and a special paraprofessional job description poster. Links to these items will be included in your post-webinar email. If you have any questions during Julie's presentation, just type them into the question box in your webinar control panel. We can't promise that we'll get to everyone's questions, but we'll do our best. So without further delay, it's my great pleasure to introduce today's presenter, Dr. Julie Causton. Dr. Julie Causton is an associate professor in the Inclusive and Special Education program in the Department of Teaching and Leadership at Syracuse University. Her teaching, research, and consulting are guided by a passion for inclusive education. A former elementary, middle school, and high school special education teacher herself, Julie knows firsthand how inclusion leads to better outcomes for students. Julie also works with administrators, teachers, and paraprofessionals to help promote and improve inclusive practices. She hosts dynamic presentations, has provided educational evaluations, and has authored numerous books which are available through Brooks Publishing. Welcome, Julie, to our presentation today, and we are looking forward to hearing about paraprofessionals in the inclusive class.
Great. Thank you so much, Nicole and Sharon from Brooks Publishing. Hi, everyone. I'm Julie Causton, and I'm excited to spend some time with you today as we talk about the role of the paraprofessional in the inclusive class. I would like to start by saying that I've looked over the list of people in attendance today, and I recognize that some of you are not paraprofessionals. Some of you are parents, some of you are educators, some of you are administrators, and I would just like to say welcome. The content of today's class will work no matter what role you have in school, or if you're a parent of a child with a disability, or whatever your role you're in. I'll be talking about lots of ideas for creating more inclusive schools in inclusive classrooms. So welcome, welcome. I'm excited to be with you today. I am trying to advance the slide. And it's not working. Maybe it is. Okay, great. Okay, I'm just going to talk through a little bit about the agenda for today. We'll start with an opening and introductions. We're going to talk about categories of disability for a brief minute, only because I want to talk about, a lot of people ask me the question, tell me who, when you say students, are you talking about students with significant disabilities, students with mild disabilities, students with learning disabilities? So I want to answer that question for you quickly. And then we'll get into ideas of inclusion and belonging, just as some foundational information. And then we'll get into friendships and social interactions for students with disabilities in schools. I'll talk a lot about paraprofessional support or other supports that can be effective and be made to be just right in the inclusive classroom. I'll talk a little bit about learning and multiple intelligences, and hopefully we'll have time to talk about challenging behavior. So how do you support students with challenging behavior in inclusive classrooms? So you heard Nicole's introduction of me. I'm going to share a little bit more about who I am, just so you might have a sense who you're listening to if you don't know me already. I was an inclusive special education teacher, and I taught kindergarten through 12th grade, and always in inclusive settings and working with students with fairly significant disabilities in inclusive classrooms. I still am an inclusion consultant for schools and districts and families across the country. Families, I'm just going to share that I often work with families who are trying to get their students included in general ed, and sometimes I help families work with their teams, or I work with them when they're to the point of mediation or litigation around inclusion. But most of my consulting work is really done with schools and districts. So many times schools or districts will contact me to ask me to help them create a more inclusive school or district. And I do large-scale inclusive school reform work and even in small-scale teamwork. Maybe there's a student with a disability that a team is really struggling to include well. I'll help with that, or I'll help with large schools and districts. I currently am a professor at Syracuse University, and I am in charge of the Inclusive Elementary and Special Education program. And you can see listed on the screen, I have my research interests. So I spend a great deal of time researching and studying best practices in inclusive education. I'm particularly interested in students with autism, but I work with students with all 13 federal categories of disability. I also focus a lot on collaboration because I feel like for many people, including the students, is not as difficult as it is to reconceptualize roles and rethink what it means to be an educator in an inclusive setting. And paraprofessionals have been a passion of mine for a long time, the role of a paraprofessional, particularly because I find that paraprofessionals can be so helpful, useful, supportive to the goals of inclusive education. And I've found that when professionals are not trained to do the work of inclusion, I find that paraprofessionals can sometimes get in the way of social relationships and get in the way of academic performance. So I will be talking about that a lot today. And lastly, I spend a great deal of time thinking about how to differentiate. So how do you take a range of learners in one classroom? In any one classroom, I'll just say, imagine a 4th grade classroom. You will expect a range of learners from an academic range, a behavioral range, a communication range, and differentiation for me is all about how do we think about all learners at the same time, and how do we teach all learners together. I thought you might want to know just a little bit about me personally, so I'm just showing you pictures of my children because they're adorable. And I also wanted to tell you that when my son introduced me to his 2nd grade teacher, he said, "My mom's a doctor, but she's not the kind that helps people." So you might find that to be true today also. In the middle there, that's my girlfriend Stephanie and I was just talking about my French Bulldog and my Golden Doodle. So that's Murphy and Bo. Hopefully you won't hear them bark today. Here's how I plan to use the book. Many of you maybe already have the book, the Paraprofessionals Handbook for Effective Support in Inclusive Classrooms. Today I'm going to be talking about little excerpts from it. And in the handouts that accompany this webinar, you've got a couple different pages from this book so that you can refer to that as I'm speaking. But why I study paraprofessionals is this question right here on the slide. And the reason that I study paraprofessionals is because I actually think that when it comes to inclusive education, we've really decided that paraprofessionals are the answer to inclusion. And what I mean by that is very often for a student to be included, a district will decide we'll put a paraprofessional with them, and that way we can assure that they're included. And I think the thinking behind that is right on. The thinking behind that is let's make sure that this student is well supported, and make sure that the student has access to academics and make sure that this student has access to modifications and adaptations right on the spot. And I think all of that is really well-intentioned. I also think we think carefully about how to most effectively use supports for students so that they're seamless, so that they're integrated, so that the supports are silent. And I talk throughout this presentation about how to do that work in schools. I'm just going to kick off right away talking today about what I can see. I said earlier, I visit schools, multiple times a week, observing and watching and doing research. And I too often see things like a paraprofessional who does not have communication time with educators, or a student who is flanked by a professional, flanked or velcroed to or close by a paraprofessional. I often go places and people say to me, Julie, to see our room. Or Julie, over there, those are our inclusion students. And one of the things I believe to be is if you have an inclusion room and if you have inclusion students, you don't really have inclusion. So in inclusive schools, you would see all students are included and you wouldn't see between students who are included and students who aren't. I often see social interactions blocked by structure. And what I mean by that, sometimes you'll see students who are related ways that we do special education in the United States. So social interactions are blocked by the fact that during recess the student is working with an occupational therapist, or during a partner assignment they're supposed to be working with another student, a paraprofessional is working with that student instead of thinking about that student-to-student interaction. Or students are pulled out for services. So students are leaving the classroom in and out all day long, and that actually disrupts their social interactions and their academic success. The other thing I see, students becoming dependent upon adults. I'll give an example of this. The other day I was in a classroom and the teacher said, open the book to page 432. Most students opened the book. The student who I knew was supported by a paraprofessional, instead of looking for their book to take it out, they craned their head around the room in search of the paraprofessional. And that's a good indication for me that that student is overly dependent on adults. We want our students to be as independent or interdependent as possible. When I say the word interdependent, I'm going to talk more about this later. What I mean is dependent upon peers or friends as opposed to people who are paid to support. And the last thing that I too often see are paraprofessionals who are not effectively utilized. And please forgive the term utilized or utilization. I'm struggling to find a different term for this. But what I mean is I see these incredibly creative, capable paraprofessionals who are spending too much time seated in the back of the room while an educator is teaching. And what I want to have happen is that paraprofessionals' skills and talents are utilized throughout the school day so that we can all benefit from their experience and expertise. What I like to see more of would be students naturally included. Paraprofessional support that is what I call just right. Teachers effectively communicating with paraprofessionals. Paraprofessional support that is fated. When I say fated here, what I mean is paraprofessionals who are stepping back from students, who are engineering social relationships, who are engineering partnerships, instead of jumping to support. What I'd like to see more of would be truly inclusive schools, where all students, whether they have or do not have a disability, are part of the general education classroom, they're part of the social scene, and there is really no distinguishing structures or schedules for students with disabilities. Services and supports that are provided seamlessly. What I'd like to see is instead of having students leave to learn for supports, I'd rather like to see services and supports brought directly to a student. And then lastly, I'd like to see more of student interdependence or independence. I just roughly want to talk about a few foundational facts here. Just so you know, there are over 6 million students labeled with special education needs. And as inclusion has increased, so has the utilization of paraprofessionals. Currently, there are about 634,000 paraprofessionals in the country, and 91% of public schools have paraprofessionals or utilize paraprofessional support. One thing I need you to hear loud and clear is that that special education is a service, not a place. So when I say the term special education, what I'd like you to think about are portable services that can be brought directly to students. Not a place, not a room, not a space, but instead all the services and supports that can help our students with disabilities to be successful. So I'm talking about the 13 federal categories of disability today for a reason. Many people ask me, who are you talking about when you say kids with disabilities or students with disabilities? And I think it's good to just spend a minute to review what are the 13 federal categories of disabilities. I'm going to share with you, I just dropped down the word autism, so you've got one right now. Often when I do these presentations in person, I ask people to list for me all the 13 federal categories of disability. So I'm going to ask you that question to reflect on for a minute. If I were to ask you to list the 13 federal categories of disability, how many could you list? I know you could list autism because it's already there. So how many could you list? Just going to ask you to think about that for a minute. I will show you the list of 13 federal categories of disability. Autism, deaf blindness, those are students who are both deaf and blind. Emotional disturbance, deafness is its own category. Hearing impairment is its own category. The old term is mental retardation. The new term is intellectual disability, multiple disabilities, orthopedic impairments, other health impairments, specific learning disabilities, speech and language impairments, traumatic brain injury, and visual impairments. Those are the 13 categories of disability. Anyone who has an IEP in any school setting has a label of one of those 13 federal categories of disabilities. What I'd like you to do right now is look at this list and just for a minute think about which are the most common. So which of these categories of disability are the most common? And here's the answer. So this is a pie chart that has all the students in the United States labeled with any disability label at all. And over 50%, it's actually over 50% now, of students with disabilities in schools have specific learning disabilities. And then you can see speech and language impairments, you can see mental retardation or intellectual disability, and emotional disturbance. And those are called the high incidence disabilities. All the rest are considered low incidence disabilities. The reason I'm sharing this is people ask me, well, who do you mean? And they often ask me this question, well, Julie, where do you draw the line? You can't mean that you think all students with all disability labels can be included. And my answer to that is I draw the line clearly and distinctly around all students in schools. So what I mean is when people ask me the question, well, who don't you mean? You know, who can't be included? I'm actually talking about all students. I have yet to meet a student who cannot be included for most or part of every single school day. And so I just want to get that out there. When I'm talking about inclusion, I'm talking about all students, and I'm not really making exceptions. I want to tell you about two people here. So if you look on the bottom left-hand corner, you'll see Mark Radel. And if you look on the right-hand corner here, you'll see Jonathan Mooney. They're students of different ages, obviously. I'm going to start with Mark and tell you Mark is a student in New York State here. And he's a student with Down syndrome. And this student is very actively included in general education settings. One day, though, I went to work with Mark's team and they were having a hard time with this idea of transitions. He was struggling every time he needed to go to from art class to from his class to music class, or from art class back, or any of those kinds of transitions. He was falling to the ground and really struggling with behavior. And when I met with this team, it was really interesting to hear the questions they were asking. What they weren't asking is, I don't think Mark can cut it in this inclusive setting, or maybe we should find him another placement. Instead, they were asking questions like, how can we make sure transitions are successful? How can we make sure Mark feels like a part of this classroom? How can we make sure to utilize his friends and support so that he can be more successful with transitions? They were asking all the right questions. And the thing about this team that I loved is they were creative in their approach. They didn't just go with the typical sticker chart, right, which is really common in schools. Let's give them a sticker chart. Instead, they looked far beyond the sticker chart. And they brainstormed and tried different things, and they finally came up with a great solution, which was a key. They simply gave Mark a key and asked him to be in charge of opening the doors. I got to see him transition, and it was nothing short of miraculous. Shortly after they had given him the key, I watched a transition take place, and it was from class to art. And the teacher just said, Mark, remember there's 1 minute until art class, and I know you're going to open the door to the art room. Mark was front in line. He was reminding students to put things away. He was getting everybody organized. He was leading the class down the hall. He had a lot of pride in his stance and his posture. And he opened that art door, got everybody settled, and got everybody everybody started to work. And I thought to myself, this is what inclusive education is. It's about a team of people who see challenges as problems to be solved and who work together to figure those out, and who often think way outside of the box and move away from those traditional things like sticker charts or those punitive behavior programs. So that's just an example. Utilizing Mark's strengths, he's a very strong leader, and I just think that speaks volumes to what we're looking for when it comes to inclusive classrooms. I'm also going to talk about Jonathan. He's over here on the right, Jonathan Mooney. If you don't know who he is, he's an author of a number of books, but one of them is called The Short Bus. And he speaks about being a student. He speaks from an adult perspective about being a student labeled with ADHD and a learning disability his entire life. And he talks about kindergarten, when he first encountered the desk. And he says, you know what, I didn't have a disability until I encountered the desk. That's when I became disabled. And because I was expected to sit still, quietly, not move for hours and hours at a time, my disability became evident. And he really asks us to think about how disabilities are created or not in certain environments. So I want to share a couple of lessons from Mark and Jonathan. Jonathan talks about disability being an attribute, that ADHD in his life actually helps him in millions of ways every day to be more successful. He talks about ADHD, for example, as not a deficit of attention, but actually paying attention to too much. And he talks about how that can be actually a very nice attribute to have. In Mark's case, for example, we had to look for his strengths. If we focused on the problem of him not being able to transition, we were getting more and more stuck. But when we focused on the fact that Mark is a leader, Mark has a lot of friends, he loves to be a good role model, all of a sudden we found a solution that focused on strengths and not deficits. Something else that we'll be talking a lot about is we need to re-examine the traditional classroom. We need to move beyond thinking about everybody's seated, everybody is quiet, and that's how we conduct our work. And we need to rethink really what it means to be in an inclusive classroom. And many of you, all of you probably on this call right now, know this to be true, but we have to look at every individual and the potential within them. I'm going to share a pretty quick story about Claire for a purpose. This is Claire. I had the pleasure of working with Claire as a 4th grade teacher. And when I first met Claire, a principal came up to me and said, he looked at the stack of IEPs in my arms and said to me, "Oh boy, I see you've got Claire." And I said, I guess I don't know who Claire is. And he said, she's awesome. She's great. It's just that Claire, well, her parents expect her to be included every minute of every day and have really unrealistic expectations. And last year, they took us to court about inclusion. And, he had a lot of things to say. And now you can see Claire's mom, Jackie, she's right there in the hat. She's a lovely person. She has a Ph.D. in special education. And she looks friendly because she has a hat on and she's standing by a lake, but don't let that fool you. No, she really is a lovely person, but here's the thing. She expected that Claire would be included every minute of every day. And as a new teacher, I had to figure out how to make that possible. Here's Claire as a little girl. This is what it says about Claire on her IEP. She uses a wheelchair, she's nonverbal, she has a cognitive disability, a metabolic disorder, etc. And that person on the bottom right-hand side is how I felt, kind of head-scratching, because I realized, okay, so she has pretty significant disabilities. Her parents expect her to be included. And there was this moment when I realized, whoa, this is my job. I have to figure out how to do this, and I'm not exactly sure what to do. Even though I'm a credentialed licensed special education teacher, I don't know what to do. And many of us will find ourselves in that position, whether we're a paraprofessional, administrator, a parent, an educator, where we have to figure out what we're going to do next to support someone. It was Claire who helped me figure out that I needed to be someone who came to the table and worked side by side. Someone who came to the table with creative ideas every day to try. Someone who looked at the data. So if we tried something new with Claire, let's just imagine we would try putting a greeting on her Big Mac switch. And we would walk, she'd walk through the halls and someone would be pushing her wheelchair and she would be greeting people. And we just took data. How many greetings did she get every day? And we tried to think about how are we going to increase those social interactions for her. We ended up spending so much time and energy thinking about how to effectively include Claire, and she was very, very successful. So one of the things I want you to think about is how to create spaces for kids that we can be successful. One of the things people say to me sometimes is, oh, inclusive education, I don't really believe in that. And that's hard for me to swallow because this is the work that I do. But I realized for a lot of us, it's not about inclusive education or what that is or what that means. It's just about this idea of belonging. And when I use belonging, meaning that people feel like a genuine part of the school community, I realized that many, many things influence belonging. And I'm just kind of clicking through them here. The classroom community affects belonging. Harassment and bullying affects belonging. The school climate affects belonging. All these things very much relate to ideas of belonging. And one of the things I think is really useful to do as someone who works in a school is to think about, am I supporting belonging or am I interfering in belonging in the ways that I'm educating this particular student? I'm just going to share this quickly, the evolution of inclusion. So we went from not educating students with disabilities, and then we started to educate students with disabilities in separate schools and then separate classrooms, and then mainstreaming. And then there was something called partial inclusion. Actually, if I were to take if I were able to see the schools in which you all come from, it is likely that partial inclusion is happening in many schools. What partial inclusion is when students are part-time members of a general education setting, where they come in and come out. And then there's inclusion, which is what we're talking about today. I think this is a really nice cartoon, Michael Giangreco's cartoon here about inclusion. So it says on the top, stop, you can't swim, you're not allowed in the pool. The second part says, we're going to throw you in, you'll either sink or swim. And then the bottom is, we'll start your swimming lessons with some fun activities and supports that will fade out later. The evolution of swimming lessons is surprisingly similar to the evolution of including students with disabilities in general education settings. So many of you, if you look at this cartoon, many of you are in different parts. Some of you are in the bottom, where kids are in general education classrooms and you're supporting them well, and you're fading supports. Some of you are in the middle section, where kids are being thrown in and supports aren't just right. They're not working, they're not effective. And some of you are still at the top, which is, we don't allow some students in. I'm going to tell you this story because it really relates to structures in schools, and I want you to just imagine, if you could imagine being here for this. So I was in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and I was doing a presentation on differentiation. Prior to the presentation, I put red dot stickers, just like you see there, red dots on 12 people's chairs around the room. This was a room of about 500 educators, and they were there to learn about differentiation. So they were learning about how to differentiate content for students with disabilities. So what I found at this point is people came in, they sat down, they got started. I started the presentation, and I was about an hour in, and I said to them, some of you really struggle with differentiation, and that's okay. And if you're someone who struggles, I know this because I've spoken to your administrators, and you will be identified because you'll have a red dot under your chair. So if everybody wouldn't mind, look under their chair. So everyone stared at me and then looked under their chair and then sat back up. And 12 people had eyes the size of saucers. They looked directly at me and were stunned that I had said that they were going to need some extra support. I said, it's no problem if you're one of the 12 people, go ahead and stand up and go to the back of the room, and in the back of the room we're going to provide you remedial differentiation support. So I would just ask you right now to think about that. Imagine if you were in that room, and you could imagine that you were one of the 12 or one of the rest of the people seated, remain seated. How would you feel if you were in that room? Most of the time when I ask this question, say I would feel embarrassed, I would feel humiliated, I would be nervous, I would feel uneasy, I would feel like trust was broken. And then what I did that day is I had a little packet on differentiation in the back, and everyone else was seeing a film called Including Samuel. If you haven't seen the film Including Samuel or haven't been to that website, I'm going to have it down right now, includingsamuel.com, I think. It's a great little website, and if you're someone who's interested in more inclusive experiences or examples, check out that film. Anyway, everyone was watching the film. The 12 people were in the back working on their packets. And when I asked everyone to come back, everyone came back and sat down, except one person. The one person who did not come directly back and sat down, instead walked right up to my microphone, said, can I say something on the microphone? And I said, no. And she said, here, just hand me the microphone. And I said, okay. So I handed her the microphone, and she got on the microphone in front of all these people and said to me, are you going to pay for my therapy? And I said, therapy? What therapy? And she said, do you have any idea what it feels like to leave to learn because of a perceived deficit? And this was exactly what I was talking about. This was exactly what I wanted someone to think about. In schools, we very often ask students to leave because of their deficits. And it creates a pretty significant challenge socially and also academically. One of the things I want you to think about were the problems that were created for any student during that professional development time that I did. The problems that were created were things like they didn't learn the same content as everyone else. Or some students felt superior to other students. People felt superior if they didn't leave. They knew that students were leaving for help. And one of the things we have to really re-examine in our school systems is the ways in which we're utilizing pull-out services. You've got a packet with you, and one of the things, I've got a definition of inclusive education here by Norman Kuntz. I'm only going to read a first paragraph because I want you to know that this is what I'm talking about when I say inclusion. It's the valuing of diversity within the human community. When inclusive education is fully embraced, we abandon the idea that children have to become normal in order to contribute to the world. We begin to look beyond typical ways of being valued members of the community, and in doing so, begin to realize the achievable goal of providing all children with an authentic sense of belonging. I want to share this definition and actually just turn your attention for a minute to this page, because I love this definition provided by Norman Kuntz. And if you are a school administrator, I actually challenge you to use this as a North Star for your school or district. If you're a paraprofessional, I want you to know that this is what inclusive education is about. It's moving beyond remove and remediate, right? Pull out and fix. And it's moving to include, support, and learn together. I'm just going to quickly talk about this because a lot of people say, okay, Julie, great, but I teach high school, and I don't really think inclusion can happen. And I just want to share that I think inclusion is just as easy in high school as it is in elementary school. And the word easy is, well, it's not, right? It's just the same, though. And in many cases, inclusion in high school is easier because of the schedule, because you can take big ideas from teaching, like key topics from the curriculum, because there are options in scheduling like home economics and the school store and things like that, and you can choose classes geared to particular interests and skills. So I just wanted to share that because people often ask me, oh, and also extracurriculars, right? Clubs and sports and dances and things like that. Okay, I'm looking at the time and making decisions because I know people want to ask questions. So I want to get to some strategies and ideas. The first thing I want you to think about if you're supporting a student is friendship and social interactions. I want to share this quote from Birger Sellen, which is about friendships. And he's a person who has autism, and he states, "I will make my way back, groping from the world where I am beside myself. I am always discovering ways I have looked for islands whose shores I guess at. I would be lying if I were to describe loneliness as if it were something I wanted. Loneliness is my enemy, and I will fight the good fight against it." This quote causes me to think about what it might be like to be a student with a disability, particularly a student who is supported by an adult. And I want you to think about what it might be like to not have friendships or social interactions. And so I want to talk for a minute about how friendships are made. Friendships are made by having common experiences, positive interactions over long periods of time. In inclusive classrooms, that is the place where we can best create social interactions. And the foundations for social relationships come from rich social environment with students who do not struggle to communicate. Additionally, we've got to think about strategies that promote interaction. So if you're a paraprofessional or if you're someone who supports students with disabilities, I want you to think about how often are you connecting the student you're supporting to others in the classroom. Things like group work, think, pair, shares, talk walks where you're asking students to walk together and talk together. If you're supporting a student in a wheelchair, who is pushing the wheelchair? Who is surrounding that student? How are you making sure that interactions are very possible? And parents willing to organize and supervise. I want to talk about how we can best support students. And you've probably seen some of these cartoons, Michael Giangreco, who I adore. He's put together some cartoons about the absurdities and realities of special education. And one of the things we've got to really think about is, are we helping or are we hovering? I very often teach paraprofessionals to fade their support, and it is a trickier skill than we think. Because often we think our job as a paraprofessional is to sit next to, provide direct support, hand-over-hand assistance, and we find that that's not exactly the best or most effective way to support students. So we've got to think about, what should we do? How can we help? One of the detrimental effects that we know to be true about, it says here paraprofessional support, but I'm going to ask you to think about this differently. It's actually the detrimental effects of over-support, providing too much support. Students become dependent upon adults. Peer relationships get interfered with. New behavior problems occur. Students are separated from classmates. And the relationship actually replaces the typical peer connection. We also know that there's quite a stigmatization. You have an adult that supports you throughout the day that can very much impact belonging. So I'm going to talk about, I'm just kind of moving quickly because I want to talk about some good ideas for you. When you're thinking about supporting someone, a lot of times paraprofessionals say to me, God, my job was to sit next to Joe. And I'm going to suggest that your job is to do three things. It is to help Joe become as independent as possible. It's to help Joe connect to other students. And it is to fade your support. I want to talk about the chair. If you support a student in a classroom and you've got an adult chair next to that student, I would like you to rethink that. Whenever I'm doing presentations that are live, I very often move a chair next to some unknowing participant and sit right there while I'm presenting. And I ask the room, what does my presence, as I support this particular person, do for the rest of you? And it's so interesting because all the participants often say things like, I wouldn't want to talk with her because she's, with the teacher. Or they might say things like, I think this person needs so much help and support that they've rearranged the classroom. So think about, how can you provide support that is not directly side by side with student, but instead you might, for example, change the materials, or change the accommodation, or change the support. So instead of, say, for example, sitting next to a student and listing for them what they need to do next, so I see this all the time, they'll say, Joe, you need to take out your book, you need to open the page, you need to start writing your sentences. That's right, yep, keep writing, good job, right? That's over support. Instead, that paraprofessional or support person could have written the to-do list and walked away. Or if Joe doesn't read, they could have written a to-do list and told a partner of Joe's, so you guys, this is your job, you got to get this stuff done. And they could have worked together side by side to do that. So these are the kinds of things that I want you to consider when you're providing support, is fading that support. And I often say burn the chair, right? Don't put a chair next to a particular student. The reasons to promote independence is, I'm just going to say that you have students learn to ask for help. It allows the students to develop self-determination and advocacy skills. And it promotes a sense of agency and empowerment. And the student is able to use his or her own voice. Lastly, it promotes less adult support. Oh, not lastly, sorry. And then obviously connection with others occurs regularly, and you can fade your support. In the book, you will see this chart. And what I want to talk about is, this is on page 66 of the book. It's also in your handout packet. There are types and levels of support that you want to move from most invasive to least invasive, or natural supports. So moving from full physical support, if you're providing full physical support on a Monday, you want to think, could I provide partial physical support on a Tuesday? If I'm providing modeling on a Wednesday, could I provide direct verbal support on a Thursday? And so one of the things you want to be really cognizant of is, how am I lessening support for students so they can be more and more independent or interdependent with peers? The other thing I want you to think about is how you can provide engage support while teachers are working. So for example, while a teacher is lecturing, you could be modeling note-taking on the board. That way you might not be sitting directly next to the student. While the teacher's taking attendance, you might collect homework or review homework with students. While the teacher's giving directions, the paraprofessional might write the directions on the board so that everybody has access. So I just want to turn your attention to this particular table so you can be thinking about ideas for providing more engaged support so that you might not be seated directly next to students. I'm looking at the time, and I knew I had too much to cover, so I'm going to just go quickly to talk about behavior, because I know that people want to probably talk about behavior for a minute. So, all of these ideas that you see, things like a dry erase board, post-it notes, a book stand, page ups, reading strips, highlighter tape, fidgets. These are all really, really useful tools for anybody who supports the classroom that can help promote independence and interdependence. I'm just figuring if I can skip to. Maybe what I'll do right now is, if we could, I just am thinking about timing. If we could, what I'd like to do is maybe think about questions now, and then I can end talking a little bit about behavior. I think that might be the best thing. So, Nicole, can you jump in?
Thank you so much, Julie. I know that time is of the issue here, and you've got so much fabulous information to share with us. And for anything that you're wanting to know more about, Julie's book, as she's mentioned during her webinar, is a fabulous resource that you can go to. So. And there's also some handouts too that are related to this webinar, which will be emailed to you in your post-webinar email. So you'll get some more information through that. And so let's just move in, and we'll get some questions and answers going here, and spend the last couple minutes talking about some more of the roles that the paraprofessionals have. And I know that one of the first questions we have here is if a paraprofessional is beginning the year in a classroom with a teacher and a student, what should be the first couple of steps that paraprofessional should take? Is it up for them? Is it up to them to decide what the student's going to learn that year, or what the adaptations and modifications are going to be? What are the first couple of things that you would recommend a paraprofessional do?
Oh, great. Okay, so if you're beginning in a classroom, a couple things. It's really the teachers, the educators, whether they're the general ed or special education teachers, actually in charge of that student education. However, you as a professional are an important team member. So if I were to list things I to do, the first is read the student's IEP. The second is talk to either the special education teacher about what your role will be, how you can help become more independent, and how you can take an active role in helping all the students in the class learn. So even if you're considered a one-on-one, you can support other students, specifically when you're fading your support from that particular student. So you might ask questions like, could I run a small group during literacy instruction? And the answer to that legally is yes, you can, as long as someone is providing you with the materials and the adaptations. And so responsible solely for creating adaptations, but you might be responsible for helping to carry out adaptations. The other thing I would ask, if you just begin, two more things I was thinking about. One is make sure that you get a regularly scheduled communication time with teachers. So even if it's 15 minutes before school, and I hate to say this to you, but even if it's unpaid time, I think it is worth the 15 minutes. Get in there and connect with those educators to make sure that you're clear on your role for the day, or for the week, and those kind of things. And the other thing is think about how you will be introduced. It's really important that you're introduced to all the students in the classroom in a very particular way. And my suggestion is that you're introduced as someone who's part of the teaching team, as opposed to, you know, Michael's helper or Claire's helper. Instead, really someone who's has a role on the team and will be helpful to all students.
Julie, another question has come up here. How would a paraprofessional introduce this information that you're sharing to a teacher who may not know exactly what the para's role is? I mean, how could they get this conversation going? Because sometimes, you know, if a paraprofessional thinks that they need to promote more independence, the teacher might think that the paraprofessional isn't doing their job. So how can the paraprofessional introduce this information to the teacher?
Yep, it's a really tricky thing, and it happens a lot where paraprofessionals say, oh my gosh, yes, I'm on board. Oh, my other line is ringing. I'm on board, and I definitely want to paid support, but my teacher doesn't allow me to, or my teacher doesn't really understand what that is. And so a couple things. I mean, you can actually just show them for example, an excerpt from the book about fading and talk about why fading is necessary and important. Or you can say, gosh, I think in the long term we really want the student to be very independent, and so let's think about how we can do that. So talking about things like independence and fading, sometimes it actually is the paraprofessional who's bringing those ideas to the table, and then kind of opening it up with educators to say, well, if I'm not seated directly next to this person, let's talk about something I could have in this classroom that might even help out more students.
Exactly. Good point. Now, what about in terms of a parent communicating with a paraprofessional? What's the paraprofessional's role? Like, for example, if you know the parent sees that there's some issues between the interaction of the child and the paraprofessional, what can be done about sort of, you know, bringing that to their awareness, and what's the relationship between the parent and the paraprofessional, basically?
Yeah, it's really good to become clear about that. What I mean by that is if you don't know what the role is in your district, you might ask that. And the people you could ask would obviously be the special ed teacher or the general ed teacher or even the director of special ed. Because one thing I know to be true is this varies greatly. In some districts, the paraprofessional really is a liaison to the parent. And they basically connect with parents daily. They write in the communication notebook. And I actually think that's great. And then in other districts, that's not the role that they want the paraprofessional to play. And I sometimes understand the reason for this. I'll just give an example. I was just doing a court case with a student with a disability, and they were using the communication notebook on the stand in this particular court case. And it became pretty problematic that what was said in the communication notebook. So in some ways, I understand why schools might not want paraprofessionals to be making that communication. But in most cases, I think it's very appropriate. You just want to be clear what kinds of information to be sharing with families.
Yeah, that's a great point. Now, what do you think about a paraprofessional following a child from grade to grade? I know that I've seen that in my own experiences too, and what are your thoughts on that?
Yep, I've studied this a lot. So I personally think change is okay or good, meaning maybe every year or every 2 years switching paraprofessionals. And I actually think really no more than 3 years. The reason being is because that relationship tends to become so dependent. I have a couple, so that's my general rule. You know, 2 years would be pretty healthy. 1 year is fine. 3 years, I'm getting nervous. And it just comes from this really kind of too close of a connection that can become almost familial or almost sort of motherly, or, you know, it just becomes sometimes parental. And then I have an exception to that, which is, you know, students who type to communicate, who need facilitators that are really effective and know the student. You know, so I think that there are exceptions to that rule, but in general, I think it's healthy to switch paraprofessionals after every couple of years.
If a paraprofessional is having a specific issue with or a challenge with a child, say for example the child isn't responding to the paraprofessional's direction, if the paraprofessional is looking for ways to for the child to access the curriculum, what resources are available to help the paraprofessional accommodate, communicate more effectively with the child? What would you recommend?
I would recommend reading the book to start
Yeah.
with. I mean, honestly, so there's a chapter on effective communication. There's a chapter on behavior and those kind of things. So I think that's a really good starting point. And throughout the book, I have additional resources listed at the
Okay.
end of every chapter. So I'm just telling you that's a good starting place.
Which is available at Brooks Publishing
Right.
website, correct?
Right. It's just,
Okay.
the reason I say it is I've put tons and tons of time and energy thinking about just that. How do paraprofessionals have all the resources they need to be able to go into inclusive settings and really do a great job supporting and educating students.
Okay.
So and schools get these for all their paraprofessionals. So if you don't personally want to buy it, you can also ask your superintendent or principal to consider that for all of the paraprofessionals in your school. That's where I would turn, just because there are lists and lists and lists of resources that are just
Okay.
available right there.
Julie, I think we have time for one more question here, and this is a really good one. They've all been fantastic, actually, and I'm sorry that we didn't get to all of them today, but I just want to end on this one. Oh, we've got a question coming that says, what if a student's paraprofessional is changing approximately every 30 minutes throughout the day? So basically the child is dealing with 5 paraprofessionals a day on a rotating basis. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, yes, I've seen this, and I find it just incredibly shocking. And typically, I don't know this particular student, but typically what I find is it's a student who handle very few transitions, and they're given more transitions than anyone else.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just going to be honest. What I suggest is that you pull together a team meeting and say this isn't okay for this student, and we have to figure a different schedule out.
Yeah.
That is not impossible to do, and I think that very often we see just simply too much transition in the lives of students.
Right. Uh, that's it for us in terms of questions. Julie, did you have any more final thoughts before I close out our webinar today?
No, I just want to say thank you for tuning in. I'm so sorry I had so much more to share with you, but I also, at the very end of this webinar, you'll see a link to my website, and you can always email me questions directly or connect with me directly that way. And thank you so much for your time and energy. And Nicole, thank you for doing this work.
You're welcome. And as Julie said, you can contact her via her website, which is www.inspireinclusion.com. And you can email her too through that website in case you have any questions. You can also check out more of Julie's work and learn about inclusive education through her Educator video series. And in addition, she supports parents by empowering them with knowledge of inclusion in her Parent video series. And finally, you can look for Julie's latest book, The Educator's Guide to Inclusive Practices, by following Brooks Publishing and Inspire Inclusion on Facebook. On behalf of our guest, Dr. Julie Causton, as well as Brooks Publishing and the Inclusive class, I would like to thank you very much for taking time to view this webinar. And if you haven't already done so, you can view the other 2 webinars on the Brooks Publishing website. We hope you have enjoyed this series, and have a great afternoon, everyone. Goodbye.